Hi, and welcome to this ELAN webinar on Save the Children's mobile money experiences in Somalia. During the actual webinar, we missed recording the introduction, so I'll do that now and then take you to the recording that was done live on November 28th. The ELAN is generously supported by the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and PayPal, and we appreciate them making this series of webinars possible. Today we'll be hearing from Suleiman Abdi from Save the Children Somalia, and Suleiman is our first presenter, and he currently is the Puntland Food Security and Livelihoods Program Manager for Save the Children. He is based in Cardo. We'll also be joined by Holly Welcome Radiche, who's an independent consultant, and she's a food security and livelihoods expert with extensive cash-based programming expertise. She's the co-author of the report that we'll be talking about today, More Phones, More Transfers, which is a case study of Save the Children's Emergency Food Security Program in Somalia. We'll do these introductions and then we'll go straight into an overview of the project context by Suleiman. Holly will then give us a presentation of the main findings from the report and recommendations, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. There are questions that will be posed in the chat box to the right, so those of you listening to this recording can follow the interaction that happened on the day of the webinar in that chat box. The objectives of the study were to look at the extent to which mobile money increased digital awareness, person-to-business transfers, and expanded access or engagement with financial services such as savings. So I'm very excited to hand this first presentation over to Suleiman, who will let us know a little bit about the Somalia context.
Are using cash transfers as the main approach, and mobile money is a key delivery mechanism. In terms of some background information in terms of mobile money and in Somalia, here are some key points that I want to highlight for the participants of the webinar. Mobile money use in Somalia is prevalent. It's widespread throughout, no matter where in the country. According to a recent World Bank study, 92% of the population have heard of mobile money, and 73% of the population over 16 years of age use it. It's a bit different in rural areas, have lower rates of penetration though, with only 55% of the population using it in rural communities in the greater regions of Somalia. In the aspect of gender, there is a small gap between men and women's use, only 4%. The gap is slightly higher in the rural areas, though, with a difference of 9% between men and women usage. There are 5 mobile money providers, generally divided into the geographical locations of Somaliland, Puntland, and South Central Somalia. So those of you, in the webinar participating today, Somalia is divided into 3 different geographical locations: Puntland, Somaliland, and South Central. And all these mobile money services that these different geographical locations provide are free of charge. They use the US dollar as the currency, as the main currency, and provide business and personal accounts as well. Now I want to highlight a little bit about the evolution of Save the Children cash transfer programming in Somalia. Save the Children Somalia has been implementing a cash-based programming since 2004. Cash-based programs have been conditional, mainly through cash for work, though the bulk have been unconditional due to the prevailing drought situation, emergency, the chronic crisis state in which the country is in. Up until 2014, the main delivery mechanism was hawalas, money transfer companies that are traditionally used in the Muslim world, which are agent-based. And when I say hawalas, this basically means beneficiaries coming to the hawalas, physically receiving their money. And in 2014, Save the Children Somalia country office, we began to introduce as a pilot to the use of mobile money as a primary delivery mechanism for cash transfers, phasing out hawalas, the physical cash distribution, and also we've also adopted electronic food e-vouchers, electronic vouchers for food items. Uh, Now I just want to give you guys a bit of a background and information about our USAID Food for Peace project, Save the Children Somalia. Back in October of 2016, launched the Emergency Food Assistance Project, the EFSP, for Somalia. Its purpose of the Emergency Food Security Livelihood Program, its purpose was for households access to an availability of diversified and nutritious food to increase. Initially, the project started with the restricted e-vouchers for food items, the electronic food vouchers, through vendors, business vendors, where we've entered contracts with these different vendors to providing food to the different geographical communities that we've targeted in body of Somalia. But later on in this year, in 2017, we've switched the modality from the e-vouchers, the electronic food vouchers modality, to the unrestricted cash transfers using mobile money. And and you might be wondering why we have switched from food, the e-vouchers to the mobile money transfers. And the reason why, because in early 2017, Somalia was in the midst of a harsh drought, and the category 1 emergency response activities was declared in the country. So we figured, that in transferring mobile money transfer in unconditional, unrestricted cash transfer using mobile money was the fastest way to reach our beneficiaries across Imbari, Nugal, and Hiran region. So we've switched. That's the main reason we switched the modalities from the e-vouchers to the to cash. And in Puntland, in the northeast, we've partnered with Golis, and in Hiran, in the central Somalia, Hormuz. The project, we've targeted so far some 11,077 households across Nugal, Bari, and Hiran, a total of 66,462 unique beneficiaries. Uh, Mainly, you might wonder, who are our targeted beneficiaries? We mostly targeted, the project has targeted the most vulnerable as identified by community members, including those who have high number of dependents or vulnerable members, the households who have high level of debt at the same time with reduced access to credit, no social support within the community, or no external assistance such as remittances from the Somalia diaspora, who's across the world, and also poor female-headed, child-headed, elderly, or persons with disability households were also in the targeted criteria. Furthermore, poor households who have lost productive assets. This was a key target criteria. Poor households who lost all their productive assets. They mainly their livestock due to the drought. Children admitted to OTP centers, outpatient therapeutic programs, discharged within the last 2 months of the targeting stage of the project, or lactating or pregnant women without any external support. Our monthly transfers also was based on 70% the prevailing 70% of the prevailing minimum expenditure basket in the different livelihood zones that we were targeting. And also, we've also the project, the EFSP project, the Emergency Food Security Project, with the funding from the USAID and FFP, we've provided each household with a SIM card and a mobile phone for them to receive their transfers. The transfers were also, was related to improved household dietary diversity and IYCF, infant and young child feeding practices and hygiene promotion. So this component, this IYCF component and the household dietary diversity component was a complementary component to the e-vouchers and later on the cash transfer beneficiaries. We also commissioned this study that we are currently, conducting this webinar for, just to see what's going well and what's not so far within the project, and to look at ways how we can improve and replicate for future program with focus on remote areas. Thank you.
Suleiman, thank you so much for that really great overview of the project. Just before we move to Holly, there was one clarifying question that I wanted to go ahead and get to from Nicholas, and it was a question about clarifying why there was that switch away from e-vouchers to mobile money. Was that, in his question, is that a function of the need to directly engage affiliated merchants?
Hello?
Suleiman, sorry, I was asking a question. Did you get that? You know what? We will just hold that for the end of the webinar, and I'll hand this over to Holly. Apologies for interrupting there. Holly, please go ahead.
Great, no worries. Thank you so much, and thank you, Suleiman, for that presentation. Now I'd like to talk a bit about some of the key findings from the report, and just as a point of clarification, I am the co-author. This study was conducted with my colleague, Mohammed Jama Hussein. And really maybe just to emphasize that this study was done in some of the most remote villages, and therefore it's really a subset of some of the larger beneficiaries that Save the Children is targeting. So across all of the respondents, we found that most households had more than one mobile phone, SIM card, and mobile money account. But before the project, not all of the beneficiaries had access to them. The project helped to increase ownership and access for 24% of the surveyed households. And within these households, individual access, meaning that a person could and did use mobile money, increased by 37% for all of the respondents. Most of the cash recipients claimed to have control over the Save the Children issued phones, but 9% did not. And of those who did not, there was a really high level of women and self-identified elderly respondents. So we looked at the use of mobile money, and across the areas, the respondents pointed to mobile money increasing the recipients' access and linkages to markets and reducing their needs to travel. Now, one of our focus group respondents painted a picture that was better than Amazon Prime, as we say. And he said, last time I needed shoes from Bosaso, then I sent the money to my cousin who was traveling to this village, and in 3 hours I got the shoes, which is something really unheard of before in a rural Puntland village. We also asked the respondents across 10 different goods and services, had they used mobile money in the past month, and to compare that across the year before. The two major categories that we found were for food and water. Well, we found that Puntland respondents claimed to use mobile money much more often for more goods and services, despite the perceptions that they have less reliable mobile network service. And some of these communities had only started to use mobile money in the past few months with the project. We looked at the confidence in use, which speaks to how do the users, do they know all the steps for mobile money on their own? And in general, the respondents had a very high confidence level. But there was differences across the two study areas. And within the self-identified elderly and also mobile pastoralists, they had higher responses of not feeling confident as compared to other groups. Whether the respondent was a new mobile user didn't seem to correlate to his or her level of confidence. We also looked at the respondent's ability to name in order the functions of the mobile money platform, so the different things that they could do. Most respondents showed a really low level of understanding, only able to name a few of the steps. We also found that literacy as a predictor for confidence or understanding of the process were not really straightforward, as most of the population claimed to not be able to read. In terms of cashing out and carrying balances, in both areas there were fairly close by options for cashing out, with most participants having to walk 30 minutes or less to an agent or shop where they could do so. 18% of Puntland respondents claimed to have to travel more than an hour, and it could be at sometimes over 2 hours, or they also incurred costs between $5 to $20 for transport to be able to cash out. Now, in terms of cashing out or carrying balances on the e-wallet, it was equally as common amongst the interviewed. Household consumption needs, which is basically related to food, were identified as the main driver for cashing out immediately or not doing so. And again, the self-identified mobile pastoralists had higher rates of claiming to cash out than other groups. So my colleague in the field spoke with shopkeepers, and we also talked with the focus groups and within the surveys. And we found that mobile money is really widely used in local shops, and shopkeepers maintain that it is frequently used for purchases. The observations in Puntland revealed that most of the local services, transport, water sources, and schools also accept mobile money. And interestingly, even in the areas of poor network service, mobile money is still the preferred means of payment, even if people have to climb into trees or walk to really far corners to be able to use it. We found that local shopkeepers do offer credit to customers on mobile money, and that's a really key fact because getting credit from shopkeepers in Somalia is a very common coping mechanism during times of crisis. We also found that repayment of debt is commonly repaid by third parties via mobile money as well. So we really wanted to look at solidarity and sharing because Somalia has a very strong sharing culture, and it's very common even with humanitarian support. So we really probed in the focus group discussions, and the participants they held that mobile money is commonly used to support community members in need and for family members who are far away, either in migration or in town or other parts of the country. And we probed two more formalized means of social support. One is zakat, which of course is one of the pillars of Islam, and then Quran, which is an important type of community donation, which is generally done amongst clan members and traditionally through the collection of animals, although to a certain extent with cash. According to the survey respondents, the use of mobile money to give zakat is minimal, and only 5% of the respondents reported doing so. Quran, however, was much more common. We found that overall 34% of the household respondents had claimed to use mobile money to contribute to Quran, and in Puntland it was quite high at 60%. While this can be perceived as positive because the contributions are easier and faster to collect and more secure because they're not subject to disease, the relative value of Quran has reduced. And one respondent really illustrated it well. He said, "Well, we have seen when we're collecting Quran, you expect someone to give you a goat, and he would rather pay $5. When we looked at other financial services, we found that only 5% of the survey respondents claimed to use any other financial services, and these included maybe hawalas. The focus group respondents really maintained that they weren't familiar with the products offered by other service providers. Either that or they didn't think they needed any, or they felt that they didn't have enough money to save to even participate. And in general, the attitude towards other financial services was that that banks are for the rich or for people in town. So looking at some of the main difficulties regarding receiving cash through mobile money transfers in these two areas, we broadly connected them to the mobile money ecosystem and personal use. So for the last one, that is to say, it's attributed to the user. So electricity was a primary difficulty for all households, followed by network connectivity, and then last, usage. Only 12% of the respondents asserted that they didn't have any difficulties in receiving money. So typical difficulties faced in cashing out of e-wallets were again because of the ecosystems and personal use. Huron respondents tended to have more difficulties related to personal use, while Puntland respondents faced more stemming with the local ecosystems. And liquidity became a very interesting conversation in this study. As Suleiman pointed out, the mobile money is in US dollars. There is one provider that in Somaliland that does do it in Somaliland shillings. But in these two areas, it's only in US dollars. Yet and still, people have a great interest and national pride in having Somali shillings as well. Liquidity of US dollars is a particular issue in Puntland, and 70% of the respondents found it to be a considerable problem, but in Huron, very few did. So we looked at some recommendations for the present project and then also looking forward. So for the current project, we recommended that Save the Children use the monitoring data to strengthen the local mobile money ecosystems. And so in that, Save the Children can better address issues related to proximity of agents, liquidity, network connectivity, and by closely analyzing post-distribution monitoring data and engaging with the local shopkeepers. So this approach might need to be in unison with other organizations to reach scale. We suggested that Save the Children could act as a connector between Golis and Hormuz to give feedback on the service at individual village levels, which may help paint a more accurate picture of the mobile service available. We also suggested to rethink mobile money training on mobile money to be accompaniment. We found that assuming that everyone knows how to use mobile money fully is a mistake, and that there are sizable populations that need more personalized service to help them to be more proficient in the use of mobile money. And it's important to understand that literacy is not necessarily correlated with knowledge of mobile money. The elderly, some women, and mobile pastoralists seem to need more attention and accompaniment. And Save the Children should consider it's a mobilization that includes awareness raising and digital and financial literacy. Looking towards perhaps some future projects, we suggested that Save the Children could analyze whether to purchase phones or not based on household and individual characteristics. There really could be a sweeping assumption not to purchase phones because of the really high level of ownership. But we really need to take a thoughtful look at the situation, and that requires an understanding of inter-household dynamics, such as women's and elderly people's access to phones in their households. Secondly, we suggested to take a look at financial inclusion as a part of the project design. So really to be able to understand the drivers, the supply, the demand, and the financial services in these rural unbanked populations, it's really best to work it into the project from the beginning. And financial inclusion may be a good opportunity to contribute towards resilience programming in a country such as Somalia, which has cyclical crises. An area of interest that came out of this study is related to studying the drivers and influencers on the use of e-wallets and savings on the household levels. We've definitely seen mobile money has increased, but we don't understand very much related to the power dynamics in the use in intra-household mobile money use. It would really be compelling to know how households are using e-wallets differently, what dynamics are between men and women, even generationally, and what the influencing factors behind behaviors are. And it's also important to understand if increased access correlates with increased personal control of finances, and if that is even desirable in these communities. Lastly, we also recommended to build connections between financial service providers and communities. Financial inclusion isn't going to happen suddenly, and there have been a lot of gains from this project in these targeted areas, but they really need to be sustained. So for these communities to know if other financial products are for them, they need to know what they offer and what they require. So we really recommend Save the Children to build dialogue between financial service providers and the communities they work with to demystify the products and potentially work with service providers to offer more tailored services for beneficiary populations.
Holly, thank you so much. This is such a fascinating case for us. This is the 12th webinar that we've done through the ELAN, and it's really interesting that this context, being one of the more fragile and challenging operational contexts for humanitarians, is a place where we're seeing the most uptake, the most acceptance opportunities to pay digitally for all kinds of services and products. So it's a really interesting case. And for those of you that are listening in, we are still accepting questions through the chat box. We've got a good list going that we're going to dive into now. And I wanted to start off with one clarifying question for Suleiman on the implementation context. And this question came from Nick, and he was trying to better understand that switch that happened from e-vouchers to mobile money. What was the reason behind that switch? Was it a need to directly engage with affiliated merchants? Suleiman, we're not hearing you. Can you let us know if you're able to use your microphone?
Thank you, Sarah. You know what triggered? Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
You're back now. Please go ahead.
Yes, Sarah and the participants. The question raised by our participant related to the switch from yes, can you hear me? Yes. So yeah, thank you, Sarah. The just to answer that question raised by the colleague, what triggered the switch from the e-vouchers to the cash was due to the prevailing drought situation in the country. Declared pre-famine response, Category 1 emergency response that we've declared in Somalia. So, and we've, the country office, Save the Children Somalia, identified that mobile money transfers, would be the fastest way to reach these vulnerable beneficiaries, instead of continuing with the e-vouchers, which would take a lot of time in terms of implementation, contracting of vendors, going out to these different locations, transporting trucks and food to the targeted locations. So that would have been a lot of time would have been spent on that. So we've opted for the mobile money transfers, which was the fastest way.
Great. Okay, thank you, Suleiman, for answering that question. We've got a few different categories of questions coming in, and there's a few different questions related to how Save the Children partnered with the private sector. So I'll start with trying to answer have you guys answer some of those questions first. And one of the questions was around the relationship with hawalas. Suleiman, you mentioned that shift in 2014 from depending on hawalas to moving to mobile money as a delivery mechanism was an important turning point. And the question is here, are hawalas beginning to offer mobile money agent services? And does the Save the Children country team believe that their participation would be constructive or helpful to the program beneficiaries?
I'll just jump in a little bit to explain maybe the first part related to
Seems
service
like
providers. I can't speak on behalf of the country program, but there have recently been some alliances between the mobile money providers and some of the hawalas. So you're able to send, even in the case from the United States, you can send through a hawala, which can be sent either to, it can be collected in cash, or it can be collected through mobile money. So the companies that, these 5 companies that Suleiman mentioned, they have seen this advantage to be able to make these connections. So and also, they want to be able to expand their products as much as possible. So it is a growing area within the service providers in Somalia.
Okay, great. Another question on this, Holly, was about liquidity, and was mobile money able to reduce some of that
it's a great question. So,
and challenges related to
this,
liquidity?
as I said in the presentation, it was mainly in Puntland, and what we found was that if they weren't able to cash out in U.S. dollars, then they cashed out in Somali shillings, or sometimes the households made what were sort of considered to be pressure purchases. It was a slightly different picture from the shopkeepers who said that they only paid out in Somali shillings. So it's not quite the same liquidity issue maybe that we would see in Zimbabwe, but it's hard to say if it makes it better or actually worse. It's more of the desire on the part of the recipient to have cash or to not have cash. And one of the factors related to the concerns of not being able to get enough U.S. dollars is that the Somali shilling tends to, although it in theory has an official rate, the official rate doesn't exist in country, and especially in these remote areas, you can receive a different amount. So that really affects what people can receive in terms of cash.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. There was another question specifically about the use of credit that was mentioned, and this is also coming from Nick, who was wondering how this happens at a practical level. Are customers able to kind of buy things and send mobile money later, or is there a time stamp associated with the credit? We had a partial answer from Abdullahi, but
I'd love Suleiman to answer that question,
if there's any other
as he's much more familiar with the context. Are you there, Suleiman? Okay, good. Yeah.
I also see that Abdullahi is typing, so he might be able to share a little bit more with us from the local context. Yeah. And Suleiman, if you're able to answer. Suleiman, if you're able to use the chat box to answer questions if audio isn't working, we'd love to have you participate in that way as well.
Okay.
I think what we were getting from Abdullahi's earlier response was that it's a fairly informal mechanism for taking the credit, and I didn't see that there were any timestamps associated or any other mechanisms there. Great. So I'll move to another question, which might be for Abdullahi and Suleiman, about if the communities that were served through the program had any local VSLA equivalents, and if Save the Children or any other cash working group members supported creation of VSLAs. There was a recent CARE webinar looking at VSLAs that saw pastoralists being the most aggressive savers despite all the restrictions facing them in accessing banks and agents. So curious to know if there's any experience with VSLAs in the implementation area.
I'm not sure if Suleiman is having a problem with his microphone, but I know that the colleagues in the Hiran program had mentioned that that was something that they wanted to be working on, although we weren't able to incorporate that into our study.
Okay, thank you, Holly. There was another question related to program design about what specific types of activities were implemented to support livelihoods beyond what was mentioned. Was there anything else going on in the program?
Abdullahi, I see, has added that Save the Children and other cash working group partners have supported the creation of DSLAs in Somalia. So thank you for that insight shared in the chat. Keep an eye on the chat if you're able to for some of the answers coming in from Abdullahi and Suleiman.
There's one more question coming up about program design and specifically about targeting. Holly, I'm not sure if you have an answer to this, but the question from Daniel was about how targeting was conducted and what community structures were used and how that process went. You know, this is often the most challenging part of any program, especially cash transfer.
Okay, Suleiman is telling me on another line that he's not able to talk. He's going on and off. I can speak from my experience with Save the Children on how the targeting is done with setting up village relief committees. And so through that, you know, coming up with criteria with the communities and then doing selection. Save the Children also does verification of the beneficiaries, and there is also a public verification of the communities as well to make sure that they do fit the criteria.
Okay, thanks, Holly. There was a question about how mobile phone numbers were verified, and hi, Suleiman. And so there was an answer from Suleiman in the chat about this question from Amila that it sounds to me like each household was given a mobile number by telephone service providers. From an operational perspective, I'm wondering, was there any consideration of using accounts that the beneficiaries may have already had open, or did you guys have to open up accounts for every single recipient to keep things clean?
Suleiman is having issues hearing. As far as I know, that the agreement between the two service providers was the provision of the SIM card and also the handset.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that was asked early on was about what are the lessons that could be applicable to other contexts where some of the participants are calling in from, and I think this is an interesting example because we're often thinking that it'd be great if we could use accounts that are already established rather than having for our beneficiaries rather than having to open up new accounts. And it's interesting to me that even in a context where there's such wide uptake and awareness of this mechanism, that Save the Children chose to kind of start from the beginning, and I can understand why that is often the easier implementation option. But if there's anything else you guys want to add on that program design choice and what influenced that, I think there's
I'm trying. Suleiman's trying to get into the chat. Maybe I just wanted to highlight, comparing this to some of there were the series of case studies that you all did, ELAN, related to mobile transfers. There was one in Zimbabwe. There was one in Ethiopia. One of the things that struck me in the case of this is that inter-household access and how it also could potentially give sort of individual transformation related to financial inclusion as opposed to households, and in this case really looking from a gendered perspective, certainly in a context where the division of labor, if you're working, these are mainly pastoral areas, so and men tend to move with the animals, what kind of opportunities it offers to be able to have more than one handset in the household.
Yeah, that is really interesting, Holly, and I'm curious on the gender question, along the lines of the other recommendations that you've made. One of the recommendations was to look further at the inter-household dynamics. Are there any specific questions that you would ask if you were in the position of looking at setting up a new program to better understand those dynamics?
Yeah, go ahead. No, I understood. I think that
what I'm talking
when
about
we,
is
often when we're doing the
go ahead.
The interviews for targeting of the households, maybe we're targeting the female for a cash transfer, but it might actually be interesting to be able to see, speaking to more than one member of the household and seeing what their experience is, and also doing some focus group discussions related to that, who really is using what, and what can possibly enable them to expand, use this approach to expand on other opportunities. So I don't know if that's, it's a bit general, but I think that I would want to be able to separate a bit. We also we did focus group discussions with youth, and separated them from the adults to see if there was any difference in attitudes, and certainly the youth had much more, they embraced it more. But in general, the perceptions were the same. But I think it could be interesting to be able to speak to young people on how to be able to address the issue of accompaniment, to make sure that certain members within the communities are able to, on their own, use all of the mobile money functions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's something we're often seeing of that generational divide, and how important the age categories are to take into account in addition to gender and other vulnerability and access categories. So interesting. I'm going to ask a question to the participants. Because Somalia is such an interesting environment, implementation environment, I'm curious to know, we've got people participating from different corners of the world and different implementing contexts. Going back to that very first question that was asked, what are you guys that are listening to this seeing as applicable lessons, or are you seeing similarities from your implementing environments? And while we wait for some of those responses to come in, there was a question about the charging of phones, and I'm guessing that there are some challenges around this due to electricity infrastructure, and wondering what Save the Children noticed or implemented in order to help beneficiaries.
Well, that's an interesting question. It is what we looked at, part of the ecosystem, to see what were the opportunities for charging within the communities, and we found that for the most part they had one or two options within their villages to be able to charge, but the issue is that most of these don't have like electricity by that is constant. These are through solar panels, and so solar panels only have a certain amount that they can charge. And also in areas that were smaller, where they had, let's say, a lot of cell phones and less charging, sometimes, and particularly in Puntland, households found that it wasn't as easy to charge their phone whenever they wanted. So that is really, in the longer version of the report, one of the suggestions that we make is to being able to see how to improve the ecosystems at the local level. There are some, solar panels which are available within, the trading centers not far from some of these villages, and there are local groups that are active in the communities that maybe that could be an option to see how do they facilitate the groups to be able to purchase them, or I don't know. But charging it's a little bit of an issue for sure.
Right. There's another question here from Abdullahi, and they were looking at, he's wondering if the study looked at households' preferences over mobile money transfers versus other forms of delivery. What were the preferences that came through?
Well, we didn't ask that question because it's covered in the PDMs, in the post-distribution monitoring pretty clearly. But what we saw was that, in some of the focus group discussions, the comments were things like, cash isn't even welcome anymore. So it was very clear that the communities were extremely enthusiastic to be able to have mobile money as an option. For the transfers and what it facilitated for them within their communities related to purchases.
Great. Holly, going back to the private sector engagement theme that we touched on earlier, one of the recommendations from the finding was around the fact that Save the Children could do more to address some of the ecosystem barriers using post-distribution monitoring data. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and what you would see Save the Children's role in that process being?
Sure. Well, one of them has to do with sort of the offer of who is there to be able to be an agent, the proximity of the agents in these communities. We had, I hadn't seen a lot of formal, let's say, monitoring from the shopkeepers, and they certainly, are an important actor to be engaging with upon occasion to see, do they have the services that are needed, how far away they are, what kind of practices are they doing, similarly to what would be done in a voucher program. So I think that that's something that's really important. And then also, who are the, as I mentioned before, who is providing the charging services, what kind of conditions they're in. One of the areas that we struggled in was to be able to verify the perceptions of network coverage. We asked, what people felt their network coverage was like in their villages. And while we also spoke with the service providers, they said, well, we have great coverage all over the country. We found there to be a really big difference in perception. So it might be interesting to, in some places where service can be mapped or mobile money networks can be mapped, to be able to discuss with Golis or Hormuz in these particular areas to say, we're really seeing some issues, or we don't, can you get some agents in these other villages? That would really increase the accessibility and also your business. So those are a few of the things that I think could be interesting to look at for the monitoring.
Interesting. Well, we've gotten one comment and insight from a participant that's joining us from Haiti. Jeffrey noted that it was nice to hear that other contexts are dealing with a dual currency issue. And he was wondering if there was any risk associated with cell phone distribution. Jeffrey, I'm wondering what kind of risk you had in mind there, but were there any complications or difficulties around that distribution of phones?
Yeah, I don't think I could answer that question, but what I can say is that the Save the Children tended to distribute one that was a little bit more low tech, and based on the World Bank study, there's a pretty high prevalence of smartphones within the country, so these would maybe perhaps be slightly less attractive for people for any type of risk, if that is the kind of risk that he's thinking of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's some continuing on the kind of network and phone access theme, Nick was commenting that some NGOs have used beneficiary communities to provide updates on the actual strength of the network, which can be a better barometer of real connectivity, which might be another opportunity for thinking about those ecosystem challenges. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have and I want to thank Holly for doing a great job of filling in for Suleiman while we're having the connectivity issues with him. Not sure if you can answer this, Holly, but there was a question about how the school fees were being paid and if there were differences in acceptance of mobile money versus cash between.
Well, we did ask about, there are not a lot of private schools or a lot of public schools, even in the places where Save the Children is working. It's mainly religious schools and madrasas. And in the 8 communities in Puntland that we studied, I think it was something like 90% of all of the schools accepted mobile money. So it was pretty across the board.
Great. Well, I think that's a good note for us to wrap up on. And Holly and Suleiman, I just want to really thank you for taking the time to share some of these findings with the wider community. We can put the link to the study in the chat box one more time. There's a full study that goes into the details of this evaluation of the program, and I found it really interesting because there's some really big differences between many of the environments we work in around the acceptance and uptake issue. So absolutely a lot to learn from your experiences here, and thank you to all the participants for taking part in this and for all the questions. And we also want to thank MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and PayPal for supporting the ELAN and allowing us to provide these sorts of forums for discussion and learning. And on that note, we will say thank you, and we look forward to the next opportunity to chat with you guys about programs. If you have studies or programs that you'd like to highlight, feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you very much, everybody.